Wilhelm II, King of Britain? Videntis, what have you been smoking? Although it's strange to think about, Wilhelm was the grandson of Queen Victoria, alongside about 8 million other European nobles, but that's besides the point, through his British mother, Victoria, Princess Royal. Had Britain followed absolute primogeniture, where the eldest child, irrespective of gender, ascends, instead of cognatic primogeniture, where daughters can ascend only if there are no brothers, Wilhelm would have been the King of Britain as well as a German Kaiser. So, greetings to you, over 65,000 Kaiserliche, and the 80% of wretched Frenchmen who haven't subscribed yet, as we break through the complex enigma of Wilhelm II and the Anglo-German relations. Before we delve into this scenario, you first must get this image of Wilhelm you're likely taught in schools out of your head. It was essentially invented by World War I British propaganda and the slanders of his serial philanderer uncle, King Edward VII, the very man who used concentration camps for the Boers, killing over 40,000 people. But yeah, Britain and the Windsors have always been the good guys, because great publications like the BBC say so, and they still run their propaganda to this day. But anyways, let's continue. But understand, Wilhelm was certainly no saint. He had his massive shortcomings that we are all well aware of. But now, let's acquit the Kaiser's name. Kaiser Wilhelm II is often lambasted for removing the master of realpolitik, Chancellor Bismarck. Bismarck had done an absolutely incredible job. I mean, just look at his record. Tiny little Denmark was crushed in 1864, before turning his sights on the Habsburgs in 1866, who had just overcome a massive series of revolutions and were fighting on two fronts against the Italians as well. Then, he defeated the French, an absolute paper tiger, to unify Germany, before bungling internal politics, so after years of trying to undermine the socialists and the Catholics, they were only strengthened by the time he was out of office. On top of that, he thought colonies were a waste of money, until it became clear they weren't, so he scrambled to catch up with France and Britain in 1885, way after the rivals had taken the best lands for themselves, leaving Germany with scraps. When Wilhelm took the throne, Bismarck believed he would control the Kaiser, censoring any messages that reached him, issuing contradictory orders, overruling other ministers appointed by Wilhelm, and more. Essentially treason. Finally, a minor strike in 1889 proved the breaking point. Bismarck wanted to use the strike to agitate socialist violence so he could send in the army to crush them. Wilhelm, who had a paternalistic view of the position of emperor, later recounted, quote, "The conflict between the Chancellor and me arose because of his belief that the social problems could be solved by the severest methods, and if the worst came to the worst, by means of soldiers, not by following principles of general love for mankind or humanitarian nonsense, which he believed he would have to adopt in conformity to my views." Horrified, the new Kaiser began distancing himself from the groggy old fool, eventually forcing his resignation in 1890 after the socialists received the most votes in the Reichstag elections, showing that people no longer supported the Iron Chancellor. As a true diplomatic genius, his web of alliances immediately collapsed following his dismissal. Ultimately, you just gotta tip your cap to the sheer brilliance of Bismarck. Moving on, domestically, Wilhelm was not some totalitarian dictator. He loved his people and earnestly believed he had a divine mandate to rule, pursuing progressive reforms and championing labor laws to curb socialist unrest. To Wilhelm, a strong state guided her people. In 1889, he convened an international conference in Berlin to address working conditions and push for shorter hours, better wages, and safer workplaces. By 1891, the Workers' Protection Act introduced accident insurance and restrictions on child labor, way before Britain or America. Plus, unlike Britain, Germany already had universal male suffrage, so the common man was actually being looked after by his leader. These actions of Wilhelm ultimately worked, effectively ending German emigration to the Americas as the German economy skyrocketed past the British one, something that greatly alarmed Westminster, who became extremely jealous. Wilhelm, though, had a deep connection to Britain, constantly visiting the Isles as an adolescent, and he was well aware of his heritage. In 1889, stating, quote, "The friendship with the English, which had been sealed in my blood, my honored grandfather maintained to the end of his life," end quote. Later on, during his reign, he said, quote, "The peace of the world depends on the maintenance of good relations between Germany and England," end quote. His relationship with his grandmother was strong as the two exchanged frequent letters, with Victoria seeing him as a bridge between their nations. She had been one of the first to reveal Bismarck's hold over Wilhelm, advising him against the Chancellor. When she fell fatally ill in 1901, it was Wilhelm that held her head in his arm for over an hour, not any of her children, before she died, alongside any hopes for Anglo-German détente, as Edward ascended the throne. British peer Charles Harbord, 5th Baron of Suffield, who was a close friend of Edward VII, wrote in 1913, just 1 year before World War I, quote, "Kaiser Wilhelm is, and has always been, very fond of England and the English, in spite of all that people say to the contrary. He has invariably worked for peace with England, but in spite of all his really earnest endeavors and his sincere love of this country, there has always been friction between the two courts. It is certainly not the Emperor's fault." Lastly, let's destroy this British lie about the supposed naval arms race that Wilhelm forced on Germany. Germany never thought they could compete with the Royal Navy, nor were they attempting to do so. Wilhelm put it best in his 1898 telegram, quote, "As the German army has secured us peace on land, so similarly will the Navy secure us peace on the sea," unquote. He needed a large navy to protect the vast German shipments from their now global empire, something recognized by the eminent English naval architect, Sir Edward Reed. Quote, "His motive in this striving for sea power is quite simply this, that the German Empire has too many great and distantly located interests to enable it to retain its leading position without a reasonable expansion of its maritime forces. Still less can it indulge without them the colonial aspirations and the capacity for colonizing which the German people undoubtedly possess. For the protection of its rapidly expanding commerce beyond the seas, the empire requires a strong navy. But, as an Englishman, I also confess that the threatening of this supremacy proceeding from Germany is a perfectly legitimate and honorable one, such, in fact, that Great Britain may regard it in a quite friendly sense." Step back, and a clear picture emerges. Wilhelm was a man caught between the role of Kaiser and the pressures of modern politics. Again and again, he extended the hand of friendship to Britain, supporting them during the Boer War, when nearly the entire world condemned them, refusing the Russian and French invitations to attack Britain while she was vulnerable, and seeking dialogue even as London used negotiations as cover for espionage. Yet, every gesture was rebuffed. By 1907, as Arthur Balfour privately admitted that Britain would one day have to destroy Germany to preserve her supremacy, the futility of Wilhelm's mission grows clearer. Desperate to maintain peace, he eventually was able to sign an alliance with his cousin, Tsar Nicholas II, only for the Russian politicians to immediately renege. Keep in mind, his reputation in the years before the Great War was not a warmonger, but of a peacemaker, praised by Teddy Roosevelt, Andrew Carnegie, William Howard Taft, and even many voices in France and Britain. The truth is inescapable. Wilhelm was a ruler striving to balance German power with a genuine yearning for peace, a balance Europe itself refused to accept. History was forever changed back in 1837, at the death of King William IV. With no heirs, Westminster adopted absolute primogeniture, paving the way for Queen Victoria. Thus, her first child, a daughter, Victoria, Princess Royal, was groomed for rule from a young age, despite having 4 brothers as she was the eldest, eventually marrying Frederick of Prussia in 1858. By that point, Prussia was still only the 4th strongest power in Europe, behind France, Austria, and Russia. Queen Victoria hoped the union would balance Europe and provide Britain a respectable ally. Princess Victoria's son, Wilhelm, born a year later, was raised by both Prussians and British alike, instilling both a knowledge of their political systems and a sense of dual nationalism. Britain became slightly less pleased with their newfound Hohenzollern tinge, following Prussia's successive victories over Austria in 1866 and France in 1871, which culminated in the genesis of the German Empire. Some in Parliament got cold feet on the arrangement and suggested removing the Prussian branch from succession. But Queen Victoria, quite fond of her German grandson, put these talks to rest, cementing Wilhelm as the future King of Britain, as she ensured her favorite politicians, like Benjamin Disraeli and Lord Salisbury, swung the Tories to firmly support the future monarchy. Wilhelm, she said, would also require the respect for monarchy and tradition, and be the future of her imperial vision. Plus, he had a quite austere lifestyle when compared to her sons, like Edward, who was busy sleeping with half the empire. Likewise, Bismarck worked to remove anti-British sentiments in the Kaiserreich, hoping to pave a smooth path for Wilhelm when he eventually became the emperor. Although busy in Germany, Wilhelm frequented ceremonial events in Britain during his youth, like the opening of the Thames Embankment in 1871, solidifying his image with the British people, who saw him as one of their own, who just so happened to rule over the Germans, not as a German ruling over them. Ascending the German throne in 1888, things played out similarly in both Germany and Britain until the Second Boer War. Following the Boer success in 1885, repelling the British at the Jameson Raid, Wilhelm avoided anti-British gestures, publicly offering to mediate peace in South Africa, rooting out anti-English attitudes in Germany. When the Second Boer War erupted in 1899, Wilhelm decided the time was ripe for a proper alliance to solidify his future realm, accepting his grandmother's invitation to England in a public show of support, while seemingly the rest of the world was condemning Britain. France and Russia, both fiercely anti-British at this time, praised the Boers, with private fundraising and volunteers going to South Africa, despite their government's official neutrality. This accord was then solidified as Wilhelm built upon a Reichstag proposal to ally with Britain, pressuring the deal through as Germany sent supplies and men to Cape Town. Despite some smears in the German press that he was too much of an Anglophile, with some fringes even calling for his brother, Prince Heinrich, to take the throne, the alliance crushed Boer resistance by 1902. The few remaining who had been hesitant to have a Prussian king in Britain now embraced Wilhelm, viewing his German soldiers as their Teutonic brothers. While Queen Victoria had lived to see her hopes succeed with the Anglo-German Pact, Her Majesty sadly did not live to see victory over the Boers, passing away in January 1901. She was then succeeded by Wilhelm's mother, now Queen Victoria II, but she too passed in 1901 in August. So Wilhelm traveled to London, where he was crowned King William V to the cheers and adulations of the English public. While the crowns remained separate, Wilhelm had 6 sons, so it would grow only closer under the Hohenzollerns in time. While most Brits were hesitant to accept Wilhelm's leadership, a vast majority of the Tories were convinced that they could use the new monarch to essentially hijack the rapidly growing German industry to serve Britannia's empire, enabling them to bypass the heavy tariffs America placed on her own industrial exports, so welcome the Kaiser with open arms. On top of that, Wilhelm's first real act was crushing the Boers, so his popularity skyrocketed. German conservatives too worried that it would strain the Reich and the sometimes erratic Wilhelm, pushing for Prince Heinrich once more. Wilhelm, however, saw the union as a chance to unite the Teutonic race, though admittedly, much of the domestic matters in both states ended up being decided by ministers rather than the monarch, as he was simply too busy to handle 2 global empires. However, there were some French-backed plots uncovered in England to overthrow Wilhelm in favor of Edward, though Edward was not involved himself, and the perpetrators were quickly dealt with. France reacted in horror at the Anglo-German Union, even considering war to prevent it after their machinations had failed. But once they regained their senses and recollected how well that worked over Spain in 1870, they did the French thing and surrendered, lacking the strength to compete. Russia too could not counter the combined Anglo-German might, and feared war as it could prove ruinous to the Tsardom. A loyal ally, Germany insisted Austria-Hungary be included in this new Dreibund alliance, so the Habsburgs and Brits worked in tandem to counter Russia in the Balkans and Central Asia respectively. Despite efforts by Wilhelm to convince his good friend and Nicholas II to abandon the French, and even signing a defensive alliance in 1904, Russian ministers blocked the accord once Nicholas returned to Moscow. But even still, Russia and France were nowhere near enough to compete. So after Wilhelm and Franz Joseph, emboldened, decided against renewing the Triple Alliance with the increasingly hostile Italians, Italy joined into the new Triple Entente. Here, Wilhelm's dual role eliminated competition between London and Berlin, preventing any naval buildup as their forces were used in a complementary manner, outlining shared colonial and economic interests as both nations' wealth rapidly outpaced the rest of Europe. Nonetheless, though, Germany and Britain still remained two very distinct empires who simply shared the same emperor, with their own competing national aims, but for the most part Wilhelm was able to balance this out. Meanwhile, his domestic policies bolstered the Union's stability, introducing accident insurance, pensions, child labor laws, and factory inspections, winning over British unions. In Britain, where the 1884 Third Reform Act left 40% disenfranchised, Wilhelm pushed for broader suffrage, inspired by Germany's universal male voting in the Reichstag. He worked closely with Joseph Chamberlain, the mastermind of the Anglo-German Pact, referring Tories to check the Liberals, while his reforms effectively prevented the rise of the Labour Party, as many of their demands were met under the Hohenzollern king. Wilhelm's governance addressed Britain's pressing issues with a blend of pragmatism and ambition, though not without hurdles. The Irish Home Rule crisis, simmering since the 1880s, began bubbling over again. Unionists in Ulster resisted devolution, while Irish nationalists demanded greater autonomy. Since the king worked with the Tories and stood strong by the House of Lords during the budget crisis in 1909, enabling them to keep their veto, this prevented any hopes of a Home Rule bill as the Conservative Lords vetoed it. Nonetheless, as the Irish Parliamentary Party was the third largest party in the British Parliament, as strange as that sounds, some concessions were made, empowering Irish Catholics and nationalists, though the tensions continued to rise, but Wilhelm tried his best to ignore them. Heavily reliant on Chamberlain, Wilhelm tackled the empire's overstretched colonial framework. Debates over free trade gained momentum to push talks of Chamberlain's Imperial Federation proposal, something Wilhelm greatly supported. He convened an imperial conference to establish a federal council linking Britain's dominions like Canada, Australia, and South Africa, and this quickly assumed much of the power from the parliament. However, since this was an entirely new entity that all the nations joined, Wilhelm organized it in such a way that he greatly expanded his own powers, removing many of the limitations that hamstrung him in Westminster. Commonwealth free trade policies boosted trade between the entire realm and Germany, while heavily tariffing competition for either British or German markets and manufacturers. Crucially, he began absorbing the various dominions' militaries under the federal banner, which just so coincidentally were modeled on Prussia, building a strong devotion to their monarch over any pesky government. Back in Germany, Wilhelm continued to build up her industrial capacity, bolstering the working class as cheap British goods entered her market, but this led to clashes with the Junker landowners, who resisted his push for land reforms to modernize agriculture. But since the true center of power was in the Kaiser and his loyal army, the situation remained relatively stable. Emboldened in his position, Germany took a much firmer stance during the Tangier crisis in 1905, forcing France completely out of Morocco, as the French didn't dare challenge Germany and Britain. Despite some struggles, Wilhelm's strength achieved remarkable stability for the globe, as none dared combat the combined might of Germany and England. That is, until 1914, when Wilhelm's good friend, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria, was shot by a Serb, igniting World War I. Now, you should watch this video on a very similar timeline, where Wilhelm's father, Frederick, survived longer, and Britain worked with Germany. If you appreciate my work, please subscribe and consider supporting me on Patreon to get ad-free viewing, the maps, and more. These videos are only possible thanks to my patrons' generous support. Goodbye.